these feasibility studies, but also creating hubs. Some of the big players, such as Germany, are very well established in countries having very good networks. But us, coming from Central Eastern Europe, we need this kind of collaboration. And it's interesting in Czech Republic specifically, these companies self-motivated themselves and created hubs in India where they set up desk spaces, workstations, and help each other. So I think that's something we need to still provide if we want to move a little bit to the practical sphere, how we can collaborate. Because why? The more know-how we have on the ground, the best the people who are already trained from our countries can then explain the bureaucratic procedures, which are often complex. There are red tapes, and they slow down any sort of processes where they can get the proper certification and approvals. And of course, with the market access, as I said, it's limited and it's restricted on certain sectors. Then there is the big topic of data and protection and privacy concerns, especially in the digital trade and data flows. And I think these are very important to work with. And we can also work with the environmental standards. There is also a mismatch in skills. And one of my biggest concerns is how we are not very well equipped to understand the cultural and linguistic differences in the country for our businesses to actually succeed. So I think we can have very bold new plans for reducing tariffs and non-tariff barriers and the regulatory framework. We can work on some infrastructure gaps. That's all big projects long term. But in the meantime, we can really put more effort into this. Why I'm mentioning it, and this is one of my big criticisms these days, we spend so much time analyzing China, even in Czech. We know China back to front, everything about China, how they sleep and what the Belt and Road should look like, even for themselves. We drew pictures. We can all identify ports and loans, but we don't know much about our like-minded partners. So I deal with Koreans, Indians, Asian countries, and when we come to recommendations for governments, we are stuck because we end up with some, generally speaking, recommendations because we don't know all the details, nuances. Many people didn't travel to these countries, don't take time to go outside some conference hotels, so you don't know what the layout is and what the interactions are. So moving on to the second part for discussions is obviously the democracy backsliding. Globally, last 17 years, we had a consistent decline of democracy globally, everywhere. So I think what's the problem is we are moving countries from free to partially free and from partially free to not free. Even India is not labeled as a free, it's partially free in the indexes. In our countries, we have more atrocities taking place, obviously, with Ukraine, abuses of human rights. Turkey has issues. So this, Myanmar, so to speak, which was our priority country for Czech Republic. So these are struggles. We can definitely have a turning point as spaces that are democratic through better elections. We see this, I originally come from Slovakia. We just had a very strange outcome, obviously. Lots of populism involved. But I think part of it is a problem that we don't work enough with the public. You know, everywhere we say citizen, but when it comes to citizens' issues, we seem to glide over. Even the Czech V4 strategy now is about citizen, but when you go to some workshops, hour and a half is discussion, and you don't even include the lower politics debates. It's all about elite type of politics, which then creates a question mark how much we're closing the gap between what's on the ground in communities and what's in our institutions and then vis-a-vis Brussels. So I think we need to have elections very much competitive, and we are a better position now because we had a rollback from pandemic. So some of the restrictions on freedoms of movement, freedoms of assembly, that's been now improved because people can finally exercise those freedoms. But I think we are still stuck when it comes to freedom of expression and media. because we are afraid of opposing viewpoints as if we didn't have enough arguments to counter them. So I think that needs to be improved. In terms of, and interestingly, when you look at the United States, they don't have any more dramatic assaults on the Capitol. They were able to also have midterm without any violence. So looking at the autocrats, obviously, for us, what's interesting, how much influence they have on our narratives, on our societies. Both India and our spaces can work on this, because even India must be aware that some of the mechanisms that they use are within the United Nations. So they need to work with countries not to support, obviously, voting that would disrupt any sort of accountability in the human rights councils and blocking resolutions that should be bringing us together. Moving on, obviously, and I would like to touch on this maybe in the second part more, especially when we come to some conclusions in terms of their commonalities. But with terms of India, one of your questions was whether this can be helpful for the Global South. Well, we have, I think, several Global Souths, and even Global South countries are irritated when we group them together. Countries such as, you know, even like South Korea is in Asia, is not part of AUKUS or Quad. They're frustrated because they get along very well with ASEAN countries and can play the role of mediator, and some others, you know. So if you're not part of these minilateral platforms that we elevate in our documents, even in the Czech strategy on Indo-Pacific, we elevate them, but then we don't give chance to all these other partners that are like-minded. So we need to start distinguishing Global South and what the actual terminology is appropriate. And whether India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation, that was another one of your questions. Yes, but it can definitely play a player that can push back from the China's imposed view of the world order and regional order. However, there are topics we need to understand that they don't agree with us, such as the approach to Russia. We've seen it quite visibly through Jaishankar's and other leaders' speeches, even towards the EU representation. We need to accept this, that there are differences, and work with it, rather than expect just our position without having a conversation. So within the SCO, I think it will not grow into a complete alternative space, but India will also cherry pick what suits, because we do have differences. So I think we need to keep an eye, but I will stop because you have other presenters.
Thank you, Alica, for outlining some of the topics we would definitely like to elaborate on a bit further. But before we do so, I would pass the floor to Zsolt for his opening remarks.
Thank you. I take your mic. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's really a privilege to be on a panel with such terrific people, and I'm also grateful for Alica already having addressed some of the practical issues, because that means I can take on the easier job, which is focusing on big picture. And my idea was to do something that Alica also did, putting India-EU relations more into the broader context of India's general geopolitical outlook and the broader context of India, China, US triangle, and the major dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. And I'm sure in the question parts we will get into India's regional role more deeply. So Alica was already hinting at this quite common conception of India having a multi-vectoral, multi-aligned, earlier known as non-aligned, but though that's probably a dated term, foreign policy, and that's something very easy to run with. On the other hand, in the press nowadays, India is sometimes simply mentioned as a US ally, which is probably also a simplification. having that said, between these two extremes, I want to leave you with a more concrete recommendation. So I will be outright in saying that I'm falling more in the second camp. I do think that it's important to see that Indian foreign policy have shifted from a non-alignment or multi-alignment or a multi-vectoral approach to, if not being aligned with certain powers, but definitely towards very strong, very deep strategic cooperation with one of the great powers, that is the United States, and to a very bitter and, if not zero-sum, almost close to zero-sum relationship with China. So don't run away with Indian multi-vectoral foreign policy, even when Indians speak about it. It should be understood that Indians have always been very flexible, even about non-alignment. They all but aligned with the Soviet Union in the 70s. They can do that to the US today. No issue there. So, and this is an important context if we, as the European Union, want to approach India. We should understand that they by no means limit their foreign policy based on common democratic conceptions. That's not why we are like-minded powers, and I'm sure we will get into that too. But we are like-minded powers in the sense that India is a strategic partner of the United States against China, period. And as to the degree the EU wants to, or is compelled to see China as a systemic rival, to that degree, India is a like-minded partner for us too. India and China are currently logged. I would argue they are logged into a very tough geopolitical competition, just by the virtue of one being of them being neighbors, and one depending deeply on Indian Ocean sea lines of communication, and the other one being able to block the, if not block, but at least disrupt these lines of communication that already logs them into a very vulnerable relationship, and this relationship has deteriorated in the last 3, 4, 5 years to degrees that I think many would not have imagined before. With just almost 2 years ago, people dying on the contested borderlands between the two countries, which is not something that happened in the last 50 years. It's a new old phenomena in Sino-Indian relationship, and for that reason, India has been shifting towards more partnership with the United States ever since the end of Cold War. But there were many very difficult issues in Indo-US relationship, and we've had a civil nuclear agreement in 2005, and that has not truly been realized ever since. In trade, in investment, in intellectual property, the two countries have been butting heads. And having that said, today we got to the point when India is, I would argue, as close to a US ally as close you can get without becoming one. It's not a US ally. It's a word is a bad word for Indians. You don't use that with them, and it's true that since the Cold War and since NATO, we tend to understand alliances and being an allied country in terms of having something similar to Article 5, which, by the way, has not been the definition of an alliance classically in the past, but at least it's a very strong strategic partnership that the two countries have. And what I would like to leave you with is understanding that while Indians, Dr. Jaishankar's book, Subramaniam Jaishankar, foreign minister of India. He's a brilliant guy. He published a book maybe 3 years ago. We are just publishing it in Hungarian tomorrow, which is truly a pleasure. It's really an interesting book. The case he's making is that India is having a multi-vectoral foreign policy in a very, very transactionalist world. And that means that India can cooperate and compete with countries in different dimensions at the same time. I would really like to make a case or recommend you the view that while this is true, the important thing that motivates Indian foreign policy is increasing their own strength, primary vis-a-vis China, and how the EU, how trade with the EU, how investment from the EU, how technological cooperation with the EU can further this goal will greatly affect how flexible and open the Indians will be when it comes to our free trade negotiations or our technological trade and technological council cooperation with India. Alita also mentioned these multi or mini-lateral fora, which are also very important to understand how Indians are thinking about them, because BRICS is something very often brought up as a proof of India conducting a multi-vectoral foreign policy, because they are having a military competition with China in their contested Himalayan borders, but at the same time they are perfectly willing to cooperate with China on matters of global governance. I would recommend the view that India is present in BRICS and in the Shanghai organization, at least currently, primarily to be present on fora which otherwise would be dominated by China. So it's not that India is playing in two teams. Indians believe they don't play in teams, and I would argue they do play very close to one of the teams in this regard. I also would love to speak about India's regional role, which I believe we will touch on later, so I'm not going to get into that. But to close my opening intervention, I would just say these are the primary considerations of Indian foreign policy. If EU wants to increase its cooperation with India, then we have to overcome a lot of challenges in this bilateral relationship. If we take a list of various factors impacting India-EU relationship, I think one could very easily be pessimistic. I would not recommend that, because this is an extremely important bilateral relationship. India in the coming decade or two will be what China used to be a decade or two ago, and we just can't ignore that. But we need to be clear about how we or what we can offer to India if we want to have something in turn, which is something the Indians will perfectly understand. As I said, they have a very transactionalist mindset. And I think I pass the mic.
Thank you, Zsolt. Very interesting outline when it comes to India's relations with China. I would definitely like to get back to that later on in the conversation, also in regards to actually the regional dynamics. But before we do so, last but not least, I would pass the floor to Fanny for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Ziga. Good morning. It is a privilege all the same to receive colleagues from the Visegrad countries, and I hope I will sorry, I hope I will not sound like a Brussels robot or anything like that. To bounce off on Alitsa's point on committing to a better understanding of between the EU and India, I very much agree. I was at an event that was themed on the free trade agreement, and one of the Indian speakers said, "Please open a book about India." So thinking about trade, but also thinking on the short term and long term about actually strengthening the partnership, it would start at the bilateral EU-India level and have better mutual understanding, because it if you boost understanding of each other, then you understand each other's regulations, why you do things the way you do, and in some way it leads to trust. So the evident example is the Trade and Technology Council that has led to the Semiconductor Agreement, Memorandum of Understanding. Still a start that was agreed on last week, meaning that informations about the supply chains will be exchanged, capability will be built, and yes, if you decide to have to cooperate on a supply chain, it starts with the standards, it starts with the people and skills. So that's a positive point. Now, yes, it's a start. It's taken maybe a while to get here. I know that perhaps many before me, including Stefania to my right, have had these conversations about going beyond aid with beyond trade. Sorry for the lapses, with India for 10 years, 15, I don't know. Then I guess I would like to go to the other next question, which is there's an escalation of geopolitical importance here. So from, you know, this transactional supply chain cooperation that is actually the heart of a lot of geopolitical questions nowadays, you have this question: how can India balance its relations with the EU and US on one side and Russia and China on the other? Which is a bit of an intense question. So first of all, you know, it kind of brings to mind this block view of EU-US versus Russia-China. But as Zsolt very interestingly explained, it's more about what is to the best interest of India right now, is to secure its supply chain, secure its borders, secure its interests. And it's interesting, not to be cynical, but it's interesting what you said about like-mindedness being about the EU is a friend of the US and it also has money, so I should be friends with EU. It's food for thought. I wouldn't say yeah. So I would like to maybe reformulate the initial question into how can the EU play its cards well and bring added value to India that India cannot find elsewhere, or that India counts as impactful. Because how can India balance its own relations is maybe a question, hopefully, for the Indian government, Indian experts. And the EU, thankfully, is maybe thinking, well, the EU has something to bring. Let's see what it is and how India will do with that. So this is when supply chains and geopolitics merge, and I would say it is specific to certain geographies. So we have the EU, we have 27 member states, institutions, banks, etc., that are providing different things to India. And on the Indian side, if we're talking about the topic of not just trade or aid, development aid, but connectivity, as the links and the infrastructure investments we are going into now with Global Gateway, we have to have this duality of understanding what the so-called Team Europe can bring to India, but also where it can be brought. And this is something at CEPS we work on a lot, Global Gateway implementation and what it looks like. Now we know that India seeks to diversify and its partnerships and reduces different dependencies and keep a safe distance from China. We see this kind of act of balancing with the India, Middle East, China corridor that was announced at the New Delhi G20 meeting. And from a very practical point of view, it seemed that it was profitable to side with the United States and the European Union on this one. They are signatories of this Memorandum of Understanding to build a multi-infrastructure connectivity corridor from India to Europe. This partnership is based on resource aggregation, so everybody brings their money, expertise, and resources to the table. So it's a very practical act of balancing partnerships. And I will come back to the IMEC example, because I will not say India, Middle East, Europe corridor in its entirety every time. I will say IMEC from now on. to the question, can strengthen EU-India relations also promote closer ties with the Global South? With the same maybe skepticism as my colleagues. So first of all, what closer ties do we want with the Global South? I think that's one of the questions that the EU tried to answer with the Samoa Agreement that was signed earlier this month, and I think it was dubbed Beyond Trade and Aid, which are words that I've accidentally mixed earlier in this speech. That's one question. What does closer ties with Global South mean? Does it mean better supply chain resilience with safer routes to raw materials, etc.? Does it mean renewing trust with the Global South? And then, inevitably, the question, which Global South? As you said, it's a diverse group of countries. For example, the Gulf countries are signatories of IMEC. Do you put the Gulf countries in this Global South, or is it BRICS Plus? Is it the Africa, Pacific, and Caribbean countries? Who is it? And with the IMEC example, which is born out of multilateralism, which is with the platform of the G20, in which the EU does well, India does well, etc. Just looking at this example, does it bring closer tie with the Global South? It brings closer tie with the Gulf countries, no doubt to that. Closer ties with India. But then, of course, different international partners will look differently to it, depending on whether they profit from it, whether they see it as just, etc. And this is even before any project, any money has been put this, before any brick has been laid on the ground, and it will have a great impact on the EU's neighborhoods, and that leaves a lot of questions that maybe I won't have time to touch upon now. The EU, in my opinion, although this will look like a very abstract concern, the EU needs to question itself, consider this more seriously, that the Global South and the world in general is divided, that India cannot solve all our problems or all our questions with the Global South, but that indeed the EU and India are two powerhouses that can work together. And India has a leadership in some countries, in some areas, in some sectors, for example, digital public infrastructure. The EU has leadership in other sectors and other major achievements. Now a lot more dialogue is needed between the EU and India to decide what to do together and in which geography. So we have, of course, the IMEC, which is a big flagship announcement that involves a lot of countries, including the United States. And there are other geographies. You mentioned the borders, the India-China borders with the Himalaya. That's in the northeast of India. There are a lot of opportunities there because that will be the next route between South Asia and Southeast Asia, next land route. There are many different things to be done, and maybe later Ziga will have questions on the specific sectors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Funny you outlined actually this brilliant question, and not only you, but all the speakers, starting with Alica and then Zsolt followed up on what is actually the Global South. And I think this is one of those buzz trendy words that we're hearing quite often lately in Brussels especially, which kind of followed up after our understanding that not every country in the world is on our side when it comes to supporting the sanctions against Russia. So I think the definition is still to be done. I do believe that when we look at the EU, it understands, and it started to understand, that also cooperation with regional platforms, with representations of those countries that are willing to invest in the relations with EU is kind of starting to blossom. We've seen it on the finally meeting with Latin American countries. I do believe that this also goes through the connections with African Union, but obviously this branding of Global South is not clearly defined yet, and I do expect that we will have some kind of a clearer vision on what do we mean with this in the following years once also these regional cooperations start to kick in from the side of the EU. Going back to Alica, you've already opened the question of democracy and democratic partnerships, like-minded partnerships that the EU is looking to strengthen its cooperation with, which would then in the end also strengthen its role on the global level. Where is actually the balance between this normative approach, between the basis on the values and the fundamentals within the democracies, and geopolitical necessities of the EU, and how can actually we balance these two things through to actually achieve some tangible outcomes of the partnership?
I think what's important, and what you've suggested with Jaishankar and his India way, I guess, yes, India is becoming more bold. But what I'm trying to reach, I guess, link into your comment, is that EU will need to find a balance. There is no balance right now. When you look at the speeches of EU representatives going like to Asia, they are very often one-sided. You know, this is what we expect, this is what we want, and it backfires. I was in the room where India invited Lavrov, and the media here was saying how much people were booing and like refusing his comments. But I mean, a big chunk of the room was actually clapping. Every time he said something about intervention and Western falls in interventions, people were supporting him from the global south. You know, South America, Africa, India, they were on his side, even when you look at the comments. But what was interesting was to see how patronizing he was and rude to the host. When he was trying to have a conversation with him, he was offending his intelligence and preparedness. And it was for me astonishing how they put up with this. You know, for me, that was unacceptable, but that was the behavior. And it made, for me, Lavrov look not very diplomatic, considering he got such a good platform there. On the other hand, when they talk about BRICS, and there were delegates from the BRICS National Committee convincing India how much good work they're doing for the BRICS as a whole, with the way they handle the current economic sphere and the currencies, India was objecting and saying, you're not doing us any favor because majority of our trade is actually linked to Europe and elsewhere. And they were saying, well, this is small. The Russian side said this is small, but we will work on it. This is a good base. They said, well, that's not good enough for us. So this is what we need to learn in terms of freedom of speech and expression and conversation, to give platform to partners that we might not like, that we find outrageous, and have a conversation, because in the end, you will see how sometimes problematic their comments will be and out of context, even when it comes to the factual data. So we shouldn't always assume, like you mentioned, SCO India's pragmatic approach, that they sit there and agree with everything that's in the room. They are there to have tough conversations and open conversations. Another point, I did before work on EU strategy on Central Asia, and what I learned, we have all these good governance and empowerment and freedoms in our goals. But when you come to the sphere where you have lots of interests, even from oligarchs in energy sector, people being tied up to certain, let's say, coal mining and whatnot, and then also have options of other funding coming from other countries, not just EU, because our funding is limited, they will pick and choose whatever suits, like the Kazakhs and anyone, Tajikistan. So they are not just waiting for us, and therefore they will not always want to work on topics such as democratization, and there will be democratic backsliding depending who's in power, which leader is in power, and which interests are in power. So we need to realize that we have something that is very unique, it's consistent, we have a very strong multilateral approach, and we are able to commit funding where nobody else wants to put funding, because we work with this kind of portfolio in every context. And we can use that, but we don't always have access to all the groups in the region. And there we need India as our like-minded partner, even in Pacific Island states, where they have a lot of their population diasporas, business circles, where even in like Singapore, if you go to Singapore, everywhere is Indian diaspora. They can help us operate and bring these portfolios gradually on the table or open up networks that might not be possible. We need to work hand in hand. So they do have that know-how. So I think this collaboration, as we say, of like-minded countries is definitely crucial in terms of this networking. And as I said, on the other hand, what's problematic now, I find we have India and Central Europe. A lot of the focus is on military help. As you said, China is a big threat. And so the military attaches and the defense sector is what collaborates the most. That's where the focus is, not on people-to-people relations. So I actually don't have any exchanges with Indian think tanks on a level that I would have liked, because the focus is on securing more support against China in the military sector. So I think that's another one where we should work, is to empower the people-to-people relations and student exchanges. We hardly have any Indian students in our locations. People don't know what they require, how they interact, and our people hardly go there. So we don't have any of these exchanges that I think are crucial. When I was looking at the democratic information for like India, what's problematic, obviously part of it was approach to different ethnicities and groups and gender, and there are some deficiencies, even racial and LGBTQ and I plus. So I mean, all this is something that we work with. We also have issues, but we need to recognize that domestically in our member states we also have problems. We shouldn't be coming from the position we have it all worked out, because our societies just come to Central Eastern Europe. So many problems with this kind of inclusive, widespread approach. So we need to recognize we have the same problem as you have in our member states. Let's work on this together. Rather than come from a position EU is pro-human rights. Yes, from Brussels' position, but member states are failing to also uphold. So let's be on the par that we both share this issue. Issue with having NGOs involved. I see even in our countries in Central Eastern Europe, governments are cherry picking with which NGOs they will work, which media outlets will be having access to press conferences. So again, we share the same problem within the EU that Indians are also facing. They don't have these freedoms fully worked out. Independent judiciary, efficient judiciary. So these are very practical, pragmatic spheres. So I think, to conclude my comment, we should continue with this value-based and rules-based order, but in a way that is definitely more complementary as partners that both face issues and can open up networks to each other that might be closed off otherwise, rather than just come from a position. And like a final comment, practical one, when I speak to people working on different EU projects in Asia, they struggle even just with basic filling out of some applications for grants because of the training. I mean, the United Nations, Asian Development Bank have different application processes and people are not trained properly and there are overlaps. So I think that's another one, again, to work with experts who are preparing these applications for these projects that can work, to really make sure that they're okay with how to fill it out, how to submit it, how not to use same funding for similar projects. Yeah.
Thank you, Alita, for mentioning this one-sided communication from the side of the EU and the patronizing approach that some of the countries might seem as problematic, obviously. And I do share this understanding that we do have our problems as well when it comes to democratic backsliding and also media freedoms and so on. Moving on to Zsolt, you've already opened up slightly the question of India and its role on regional platforms. Maybe if you could elaborate a bit more on its competition with China and understanding basically how India tries to balance its partnership also due to its complicated relations with China.
Yes, so on India's regional role, I'm going to talk about the broader Indo-Pacific region. This is a rather new buzzword, just so that you understand. Indo-Pacific basically means the Indian Ocean, probably the eastern half of it, but maybe the Indian Ocean plus the Western Pacific. So we used to have this great Asia-Pacific framework of thinking about Asia, China and its environment, and then the Japanese and the US and the Americans and the Australians figured out that it would be great to add India and its maritime region to this concept. That would be a more useful framework for them to think about the region. It's not really an Indian idea, not originally, but this is what I'm going to use. I definitely don't just want to talk about India's narrower neighborhood, which is South Asia, basically the former British India plus Afghanistan, because it's often called the world's least integrated region. I'm not sure it's 100% fair to say that, but not entirely unfair either. So I will talk more about this broader Indo-Pacific. But as to India's regional role, so what do we mean by regional role? Do we mean trade? Do we mean security? Do we mean infrastructure? In each of these dimensions, if you look at India, you definitely will find a quite constrained power. Indian ability and frankly willingness up to rather recently has been somewhat limited when it came to engaging in trade, being a net security provider outside its direct South Asian neighborhood. We all do know that India is not huge on free trade, so they do have a free trade agreement in South Asia. They do have a free trade agreement with ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, basically Southeast Asia, south of China, east of India. But these agreements, like most free trade agreements India has, are rather shallow. The South Asian one has like thousands of sensitive items for each participant countries. The Southeast Asia one is also relatively shallow, and Indian businesses are still complaining about how it is hurting them. When we're talking about India's regional weight, we shouldn't narrowly think about free trade agreements and such formal fora. As Alica said, India does have a huge diaspora in Southeast Asia, and in the Pacific Islands they do have business networks which could be leveraged to further EU policy goals in these regions. We probably need to look beyond the formal fora India is part of. I just have to mention RCEP, RCEP, anyone familiar with that? That's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a free trade agreement between China and Southeast Asia and other Indo-Pacific countries, and India has been part of the negotiations until the 24th hour when they just chickened out in a good old Indian fashion when it comes to their attitude to free trade. This may be something relevant to keep in mind when it comes to India-EU free trade negotiations. They absolutely do not shy away from going against what we would consider rational thinking, because they are very protective of their businesses and there's some segments of their society. That's something we have to understand. Security role of India in the region, that again, it did not used to be a big deal outside of South Asia. In the narrower sense, India has been a huge net security provider for the Maldives. India has intervened in Sri Lanka, in the Sri Lankan civil war in the 90s. India obviously took a big part in liberating Bangladesh from formerly known as East Pakistan from Pakistan. outside of South Asia, India used to have a relatively minor footprint in security terms. That again somewhat changed in the 2010s, especially in the 20s. India used to have this Look East policy since the very early 90s, 91 I believe, was when they launched this Look East initiative. Look East used to mean that we look at Southeast Asia and try to engage with them. That mostly meant commerce and diplomatic engagement. In 2014, so it was already part of the electoral manifesto of the current Hindu nationalist government in India. They had this Act East improvement on the previous Look East policy, but that still mostly meant diplomatic engagement. It's really the late 2010s and especially the early 2020s when India started to elevate its relationship with Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, like Indonesia, to what they call comprehensive strategic partnership. It's basically a buzzword, but it does signal that India wanted to position itself as a regional player in Southeast Asia. And in in the early 20s, they scaled up some of their naval exercises with local countries. Indonesia comes to my mind. There was, I believe, an India, US, Japan, Philippines naval exercise in the South China Sea. And in this year, India has sold a missile corvette to Vietnam, which is probably the first time India has entered the region as a provider of actually military equipment and doing tangible things to tilt the balance of power between these minor, I mean, we're talking about Vietnam, which is a country of 90 million people, but relative to China and India, minor countries, so tilting the balance of power in their favor against China. Because again, in the very late 2010s and especially in the 20s, India-China relations had entered a new phase, and we're talking about a very fierce, very close to zero-sum competition, and now India got there to try to increase its profile in Southeast Asia as a regional security actor. That still doesn't mean any formal commitment for mutual defense or anything of that sort. That's not something Indians will, I'm not saying ever do, but in the foreseeable future. Should we talk about Western Asia, like the corridor, or can we get because that's another area. So when it comes to the Gulf and westward relations, India's role there nowadays, or in the recent weeks or month, was more highlighted when it came to infrastructure development. This India, Middle East, Europe corridor has already been mentioned. And again, India taking part in infrastructure financing and infrastructure development outside of its territory is a relatively new phenomenon. I'm sure there have been examples of Indian assistance in port or railway development everywhere in the world in the last 50 years, because there is an example for everything. But in general, India is a capital poor country. It desperately needs investment in its infrastructure, so they have to get their own infrastructure in good order before they go big abroad. So they definitely are not there to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative in this regard. Having that said, this India Middle East corridor, I believe, is interesting. It's of vastly smaller scale than the BRI, even than BRI's components in the Western Indian Ocean or in the Middle East. But I'm not entirely sure that that's a problem. It's also way more focused, because I believe Cairo's new regional train is also BRI, so everything could be BRI. This India-Middle East corridor is very specifically about developing port connectivity towards the Middle East, and then railway connectivity from the Gulf to Israel, and then port connectivity from Israel to southeastern Europe. So it's a better conceptualized idea. Obviously, India is still resource poor, relatively speaking, so they probably their way to increase their infrastructure development footprint and their regional role in this regard is probably to leverage their partnership with, for example, with the EU's Global Gateway or the US Infrastructure Development Financing Corporation, which is for example, there is now this interesting project. An Indian port development company is developing the port of Colombo, but they're not financing it. The US is. And it makes tremendous sense. I mean, the US is not great at mobilizing resources to be invested abroad into government-designated projects, but they still do have more resources for that purpose than the Indians do. But the Indians do have the local networks, so that is probably one way for India to increase its infrastructure footprint in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Zsolt. This actually leads us also, when talking about infrastructural projects, to maybe provide a bit more information on the Global Gateway and EU's ambitions when it comes to also the implementation of this project in cooperation with India or other partners, let's say, in this corridor between Europe and India. Fanny, if I can turn to you, when it comes to the ambitions of the Global Gateway, you've already mentioned some of the main aspects. When it comes to the green ambitions of the EU, green policies, this was one of the topics of the strategic partnership between the EU and India that was highlighted not only within some of those one-pagers of what we should be focusing on, but also India actually committed itself to net zero emissions by 2070. It also committed itself to reduce the carbon emissions by the end of 2030 by 45%. So do you think there's a role also within the Global Gateway project to actually work on the green policies and be the standard setter as the EU also across these infrastructural areas?
Thank you for the question. Which I will approach as climate and energy as a Global Gateway pillar. It's funny you mentioned the Port of Colombo in Sri Lanka, because I used to work in wave renewable energy in South Korea. Completely different theme, but we used to do feasibility studies for a wave energy device that would be quite close to Colombo, and that was before I joined that project. And at some time along the line, this site was abandoned, but there were two official reasons. One was that the Chinese built big breakwaters in Colombo and there were no more waves at the site. And the other reason was that the shores were too sandy. I never managed to understand what was the real reason. And obviously I wasn't going to go to Sri Lanka specifically to that site to check. I went to Sri Lanka, but ended up just meeting ministers, and that was a different thing. So when I think about it now in the context of Global Gateway and the EU, first a very global remarks, because Alica spoke of normativity when it comes to human rights. It's quite similar in terms of climate and energy. There is this sometimes approach that comes off as condescending or as just putting our standards on our partners, etc. So first of all, when we think about green ambitions, we have to think about green ambitions for whom? Is it for the EU to get our green transition done as soon as possible, secure raw materials, secure to make semiconductors, to make the technologies? These are very real concerns for the EU. And at the same time, there's all these questions of climate justice, deforestation, etc. The EU tries to address everything at the same time with umbrella policies such as including the Green Deal. And the Green Deal has many components that sometimes are a bit, can be, I forgot the word for, counterproductive to each other, but they are all important aspects. One, the interest of the EU to secure its green transition, and the other, the broader goal to become not only the climate neutral continent by 2050, but also accompany international partners to get to these goals, because all our supply chains are linked, and we have also new directives to include in our emissions the ones we create overseas or outside of the EU. Everything is linked. Now, when it comes to the EU-India partnership on green climate and energy, as you mentioned, Zol, there's this finance gap for India in order to enable this just transition in all its industries, including steel, including infrastructure, etc. There's an enormous need for capital. That was one of the things that came up the most in discussions. Sure, this regulatory cooperation, the trust, etc., what we are doing with the Trade and Technology Council is very important to get this cooperation going. And also mentioning the Global Gateway as a toolbox for this. Global Gateway is based on Team Europe delivery, and member states need to take the lead in engaging this, because they need to take the lead in engaging the private sector in the climate and energy cooperation with India. And that has been said before, there is somehow insufficient business links and visits to India, etc. I think there was, it's not exactly business, but the EU Parliament delegation for relations with India has not been able to go to India since, I think it was 2018 or 2020, most likely 2018 by the sound of it. And I think they are going for the first time since then in December. And all these people-to-people links, also to come back to Alitza's points, are very important for business matchmaking and cooperation. So yes, this was this trio that I have in mind: finance, pathways to implementation with standards, etc., and trust. And perhaps for this, the EU can participate in terms of people and businesses, but also at multilateral level. There has been on the table the question of a just energy transition partnership at G7 level. I don't know if there has been any inroads or progress on that matter, but it's as good a question as any. Thank you.
Thank you. To lift the discussion back to maybe more foreign policy / geopolitical kind of outlook. Before I do so, I would also ask all the participants if there's any questions from the audience, and I already see one there. Feel free to raise hand, or if we have anyone online, also we will get the sign about that. So please, if you could introduce yourself and ask the question.
My name is Miguel Diaz, retired, used to work with the U.S. State Department. Congratulations on the focus in India. I think we all have a long learning curve when it comes to India, here as well as in the United States. I have two questions. One is a focus question regarding India's role in Southeast Asia, and one broadly speaking about the state of democracy in India. My first question has to do with what I consider to be an inflection point in Myanmar right now, with the rebels making progress, serious progress against the military regime. My understanding is that the Chinese have moved military on the border. And so I'm wondering, on their border between Myanmar and China, I'm wondering what India brings, what kind of perspective, what kind of stakes, what kind of potential role it plays to hopefully facilitating some kind of peace agreement, might not be the right word, but some kind of end to the fighting in Myanmar. I want to get a better sense of how New Delhi looks at that particular problem, especially given the large number of Burmese Myanmars who are in India. The other question has to do with the general state of democracy in India. There is a lot of press criticism of it, but one of the things that I'm trying to understand is how regionalism and democracy kind of go hand in hand. I mean, putting aside Kashmir, you have my understanding that one of the more powerful opposition parties is the one controlling West Bengal, the Trinamool Congress Party. And in that part of India, you also have some very strong regional groupings, tribal groupings, who are fighting for greater independence around the Bangladesh and in the border with Nepal. So I'm trying to understand how New Delhi is trying to manage the democracy in terms of political infighting, political competition, along this regionalism that's pervasive in the country as well. How do you manage that?
Apologies. So I go to Myanmar first. That's a great question. So if I were a rebel in Myanmar, I'm not sure I would be extremely optimistic about India's role, because what India usually did in Myanmar was to try to make sure that for the junta, when Myanmar was under military regime, and now it again is, which India has never criticized. India has never said one bad word about the coup against Myanmar's democratically elected government. What the Indians are trying to do is not to force the Myanmar junta into the arms of the Chinese, which I am skeptical about India succeeding, but this is how they are seeing their role. So it's important to understand that being a democracy never really had much of a constraint, or never gave, it has never been a North Star for Indian foreign policy. They are separating the two things very pragmatically, which we may or may not be happy about, but it's really not their primary driving logic when it comes to their own foreign policy. The Indians don't want Myanmar to be too dependent on China for its own, I mean, not security, regime security is what we're talking about, but still. So I have seen many speculations about now being an opening to achieve some change in Myanmar, because the say pro-democracy forces have made some gains in recent weeks. I'm not sure we should hold our breath for India taking their side, and I think Myanmar is one of the points which will always be frustrating in India-US relations, and I would make the case that it's still a very strong partnership, and probably the most important partnership for India, and one of the most important ones for the US. But like Russia will always be a point of frustration, I'm afraid Myanmar will be as well. So I'm a little bit pessimistic in that regard. As to Indian democracy and India's internal regionalism, you very correctly mentioned the Trinamool Congress, which is the governing party in West Bengal, which is the Indian side of what used to be the Greater Bengal province. The eastern side is Bangladesh. That is one very strong regional party. Other states in southern India, like Tamil Nadu, are under the governance of regional local parties, ethnic, language-based parties. Right, northeast India has many smaller, partly tribally populated states that have a history of violent separatism. Those movements are not that dangerous at this point anymore. There is a lot of infight within these states. We've just had very ugly pictures from the state of Manipur, which is a small state south of Nagaland, northeast of West Bengal. I think, and we already have mentioned democratic backsliding in India, which I think is a real thing, but if there is any reason why I'm very optimistic about the Indian democracy being extremely resilient. It's the country's regionalism. It's held to govern India, so it does have its negative aspects. But India on paper, if you look at the Indian constitutional system, it's an extremely centralized federation. The central government and the parliament can do whatever it wants to the states. It can split them up. It did split up Kashmir and not just stripped it of its special autonomy, but actually degraded it to below a state level. So the central government can do crazy things with Indian states, but the state apparatus, the infrastructure is so underfunded. It's so the country is so fragmented that actually in real life there is a great deal of autonomy on local levels. And I believe whatever is taking place in the center, India is just too diverse and too big to actually go full autocratic, even if that was the purpose of the current regime, which I do not actually believe. I think many of what we see as democratic backsliding in India is just the fringes of a political ideology and a political family. But India is a big country and the fringes are big, and on an aggregate level, relatively small phenomena can affect a lot of people. So if I'm making sense, but I believe this regional fragmentation of India is a very strong guardrail against a completed democratic backsliding. If for no other reason, the current government or the current governing coalition is making inroads into these regions, but that usually means that they have to make deals with local parties to have them joining their coalition or their party. So that also has a moderating effect. A couple of years ago, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, my biggest worry about the Hindu nationalists was that they are actually a Hindi nationalist force, strong in the Hindi-speaking north of the country and leaving behind the Dravidian-speaking south or the Bengali-speaking east. And that is something that's not really true today. They are making inroads, but that also means they are opening up to other cultural groups within the country, which I believe is good. And that was forced on them as a necessary electoral strategy by the fact that India is such a diverse country that you need to make compromises to govern. I don't know if I'm making sense. Thank you.
Alica, you also wanted to add a few words.
Just very briefly on Myanmar, because that's interesting. I've been just asked when I spoke about the Czech Indo-Pacific strategy. Czech Republic was always very much in support of good governance in Myanmar. But there's a lot of, the official line has shifted from that portfolio to more humanitarian, and a lot of the work from people that I speak to who are experts and travel to region, mostly to other countries to have conversations about Myanmar, would be that a lot of things are so sensitive that, you know, some of the things you want to know, you would really need to speak to a very small specialized group of people, because none of it is really debated openly. We sort of compare this to how we used to, as a Czechoslovakia, deal with Cuba. You know, we would have our people in need foundation and all sorts of ways how we were working with them. So now it's become very much underground, I would say. These kind of influences and offsetting other players, supporting military junta and how to work with them. Like, it's really tough now to counterbalance even China, as you said. It definitely has an upper hand, I think, in the whole scheme. So I don't know how much, let's say, our efforts are in tune with India's specifically, you know, whether there is a direct communication to balance it out a bit and help. In terms of the democracy, what was interesting, again, the Czech media asked me about the use of Bharat as a name for India, because the opposition created a big coalition which is India as an abbreviation. And so that the government is so desperate to fight the opposition that they would start reviving the term Bharat, even at the high-level meetings. But constitutionally, it doesn't make any difference, you know. An opposition like, well, Shashi Tharoor is a frequent speaker, and I was on a panel with him And he commented on this, and he said it's a really mockery and disruption of government to sort of distract from the real problems, and mock the opposition and offset even like the soft power, the narrative in that way. So I mean, from my understanding, some of the tactics are definitely disruption of communications, you know, literally shut down internet communication and harassment of any sort of opposition. So this is all documented and has been put in place. So I think for us that is a problem if we are talking about like-minded country and free and fair elections and allowing opposition to really operate.
Yeah, Zsolt, do you want to?
Just extremely briefly, I totally agree, and I think that's why it's important to look at India as a like-minded partner, not because of our shared democratic values. Alica mentioned, yes, the Indian opposition is now, or most of them are now united in the Indian National Development Inclusive Alliance, India. But what the government did during their G20 presidency is, so I believe the first sentence of the Indian constitution goes, India, that is Bharat, is a democratic socialist parliamentary, yada, yada, yada. So now the president was the president of Bharat and the prime minister of Bharat. So yeah, that's a little trick with the language, which is based on the constitution, but it was a probably less than elegant way to take away this wordplay in the opposition's formation's name. Sorry.
Fanny, would you like to add anything to this, or do we move on to following questions?
I think we can move on.
Yeah, all right. Do we have any questions here among the audience? I don't think we had any with Stefania. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not exactly audience, but of course, refraining with all the interest that I've been studying India for more than a decade, so of course I cannot prevent myself from intervening in the discussion. And obviously, I hate to shut the conversation around the Bharat, which of course is also a way of describing India for Hindu. Therefore, a different description of the minority, which is still 20% of the population. And when you actually have 1.4 billion people in your country, the minority, which is 20%, is not exactly just a bunch of people. But I'm not here as a panelist, so I stop here. I actually have a question. Because today really one of the privileges is indeed, as I said, to hear from Prague and from Budapest. And if you could, in a way, summarize, let's assume that there is the summit happening soon. What would be the one expectation, realistic or not? So it doesn't have to be, a concrete deliverable for the summit, but it could also be what is the priority. So what would be the greatest desire vis-a-vis the relation with India that you see from Prague and from Budapest? Because that is actually very interesting, I think, also to see where we all see alike and where we might have gaps, because sometimes we might also have some gaps. So I would like to hear from you about that.
Well, when I studied specifically India and our relations, and I wrote a commentary, and then I also studied the Czech Indo-Pacific strategy, it definitely is surrounded, economic diplomacy is number one. And for Czech Republic, obviously it's an export-oriented country that would like to access the Indian market and diversify and as much as whatever strength they have. And I mentioned, the defense sector now, the Czech defense sector is very active. The Prime Minister traveled to Southeast Asia to 4 countries and 2 countries in Central Asia. And I believe the defense sector, we had the first republic in Czech Republic, which was very strong around defense sector. That's coming to spotlight. Just because our and this is what I'm telling you, the reality of the nationalistic, not the EU, I will tell the EU layer later, but the national interest in this would be this particular one, because India's technology is so tied up to the Soviet, and therefore we can provide the alternative as a EU sector to walk in and work with their environment. There would be some interoperability. When it comes to actual political diplomacy agenda, definitely they would raise the issue of putting pressure on Russia to stop the invasion in Ukraine, and for India to step up that conversation. So I think that would be the wishful thinking within the EU for the Czechs, even linked to their previous presidency in the EU, which was top agenda. So there are two layers, I would say.
From Hungary's side, I think I would also stress economic diplomacy primarily. I wouldn't expect Hungary to put too much pressure on India when it comes to Ukraine for reasons. And that's probably for the better when it comes to India-EU relationship. We may or may not get into that, but as we already mentioned, Indians are quite sensitive when they are becoming pressured on any policy matter that they consider their sovereign right to choose. But Hungary officially had this policy of opening to the east. To English, I would probably translate it to a pivot to east, which is not an accurate translation, but probably conveys the meaning better, which has been aiming for diversifying our external trade relations, increasing the weight of non-EU markets in this regard. And I believe, as far as Hungary is concerned, trade with India and getting a piece of that pie would be the chief goal when it comes to EU-India negotiations. In various areas, water treatment, pharmaceuticals is a sector in which there has been quite a deep cooperation between Hungarian and Indian companies in the previous decades. Hungary is receiving or has received investments from Indian companies, and that would probably be something that the economic governance of Hungary would try to increase or keep flowing in sectors like metallurgy and the processing of various raw materials. I'm not in so I would be very much watchful as to whether the India-EU free trade agreement will become an actual substantial breakthrough, or rather a shallow early harvest agreement of the kind that Indians tend to sign with other partners. We'll see about that.
All right, so quick follow-up there, and then we have one more question from online viewers.
It's a fascinating discussion, and I'm trying to contrast the drivers for our relationship with India between the EU and the US. And one of the things that comes to mind is that we do have a constituency in the US for closer Indian relations. I could think of two important forces. One is the Indian diaspora in the US, which is about 4 million. And the other, having to do with the lack of soft power, is a humongous number of Indian students going to the US. I think they've even surpassed the Chinese in terms of the numbers of Indians in the United States. I'm trying to get a sense of how ultimately foreign policy responds to a constituency. So I'm wondering, other than your business sector, what constituency do you have in Europe to better engage India? And how do you work potentially with a partner like the US, who have, in addition to money, we have other resources that we could offer the relationship? And I'm wondering how much thinking is going into that. How do you make up for your own lack of constituency uh, in, by partnering up with the U.S. and other countries who have a different type of relationship with India?
Well, I think coming from my background, we do have shortcomings, but when you actually deal with like Germans who are quite active in India and even in their other circles, what I experience when I go to India, there are very close collaborations on different, like in the exchanges and funding, you know, even in expert communities beyond what we experience. So on the EU level, I think there are various channels that I pick up on. Even we are involved in like young leadership programs where Indian think tanks are involved and people go to Berlin or Hamburg for an extended period of time. And then they also bring young brains from Europe and elsewhere, even from Russia and US. You know, this is a mixed group that goes to India as young leaders and they spend weeks there with the MPs and you know, so I meet these people. So the young generation, the university and the young experts, PhDs and other think tankers and journalists even. I met Korean journalists in this group. So these kind of programs are well established and are driven, but mostly by Western European think tanks and Indian, mainly Delhi-based, but with branches across the country, where they engage them with, like I said, parliaments and other institutions. This is very deep and very well organized. So that's what I'm familiar with this program. I even managed to get a colleague of mine from Prague, from Charles University, to be part of this program. And he reported that it's very intensive. So this kind of young generation, they're very good at the young generation. And another one is that I noticed India is so good at involving women experts in various spheres, businesses, development programs, on their on their conference programs, but also working with them. When India was organizing G20, I was there for panels that were purely women from Africa, speaking about their government reforms. Their panel in Delhi during Raisina Dialogue was women entrepreneurs from India, how they use localized funding to employ more disadvantaged groups. So I think we have more to learn from India, because I go to our panels and it's, no offense, male-dominated, same suspects all the time. Unless I'm constructing the program and put effort, they don't think about us. Giga is an exception for reaching out, because we work together in V4 platform, and I have I always push back. So I would say what you're suggesting, it feels like we will come and like you would support some but I think they already have set up programs where you could attach and even develop that we could benefit from, because honestly, we do have a lot to learn from. I'm not sure whether some of these initiatives are driven by the funding from the sponsors. They might have a precondition because lots of companies, Microsoft, whatnot, is involved in funding these events. Whether they have a condition you have to have 50% women involved or certain groups. But they have very interesting debates. Like I said, I've seen such impressive stories. And even they support European consultants who are, this is again, women going independently and just doing consultancy in different spheres. Very interesting profiles. And they bring it together, they support them through their events. So, I mean, it's not just businessmen, but it's also this kind of different spheres and also environmental groups. So I go there and the program is so rich. I mean, we come here and it's all about Ukraine. Our topics is Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. You go there and they have so many interesting topics that they bring up, even like the maritime. And I'm just sitting there and I walk out and I'm feeling like I've really experienced all sorts of developmental topics that we can work on. But like I said, our focus is very one-sided, one side driven. either China threat or war in Ukraine. But like we can tap into this, that they are ready to have these conversations with networks that we are not familiar with the so-called global south. I've never met any of these experts from Africa or Asia. I'm learning so much about different problems that they might have in Kenya. And we are learning how much they're doing some things even better because they might be using microfinance in a way that is more effective than our big EU or governmental programs.
Yes, if I may briefly.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, we already knew that we lacked the constituency, but putting it in parallel with the ones you have in the US makes it even more glaring. I would say, going off the hunch, that there may be a difference between different EU member states and Indians knowing the EU and this influencing our EU foreign policy. I'm a French citizen. I know obviously that EU foreign policy towards India is very different than French policy towards foreign policy towards India. In my graduate school in France, there were a very large. It was a business school. There were a very large number of Indians. They made the top 3 of foreigners together with Moroccans and Chinese students. And then again, I know a lot of Indian. I have a lot of Indian friends, whether outside or inside the policy sector, that are very knowledgeable about my country and its language, etc. Sure, I'm sure colonialism has something to do with it, but also in terms of projecting soft power and things like that. So I would say maybe it depends on the member states, and maybe the EU as a union doesn't market itself well enough. No, I was lucky that when there is these piecemeal initiatives, I got to benefit from it, as I was a member of the EU-India Young Leaders Exchange 2023. That's great. It's a start. I don't think it's equivalent to, for example, what is between the US and India. And at the same time, yes, I think it's maybe not the only place, but definitely higher education and exchanges between think tanks, civil society is very, very important. When students do want to go on exchange and they come from the so-called global north, I bet you haven't heard this one in a long time. It's very rare that you have the opportunity to go to alternative destinations that are not the US or Germany, etc., which are great destinations. I went myself, I decided to go to South Korea, and that was considered strange, and that was not so long ago, 2017, 2018. So maybe this is lacking, and then once again, it goes one way. Sometimes the flow of people goes one way and not the other way. So yes, more exchanges, but the issue maybe is that it takes a long time to achieve that, whereas if you already have 4 million people to start with, you're already getting somewhere.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I don't want to just cut off the conversation. So can I just ask each of our speakers for really like 2-3 sentences? We've talked quite a lot about the relations with India. We've covered quite a lot the positions of member states. Do we or should we expect stronger engagement of the EU in terms of its relations with India? Is the current framework sufficient for now? How do you rate what is ahead of us? Who wants to go? And really try to squeeze it in a few sentences. Should we support stronger cooperation with India? Is the current framework enough? Or where does it lead us?
First of all, India will have elections next year, so we have to wait what will come out. Then we can have a conversation how fair and square it was and who won. So that's one thing to look at. We definitely should have more conversation because everyone is having more conversation, but it cannot happen in isolation. We really need to engage more. I have to say, I think EU has very small participation in some discussions, even in Indo-Pacific. We selected a few reps. And I think EU needs to tap into its expertise and voices more and engage. Like today is impressive that we're here and able to talk about this, because I normally meet a EU rep and I don't even know what they're working on, you know. So I think we need to step up, be more proactive, and find a right format. Today was clear that we cannot be patronizing in certain ways, that there is such a force in Indo-Pacific. It's a majority of world population now. It won't stop. It won't change to our picture anymore, our image. We need to find a way how to communicate better our priorities and listen better, and maybe find ways how to reach out so we don't have an alternative that frustrates us and is dangerous, that we have better control of how the world will be shaped. So I think we need to sit back and think about better communication strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I absolutely agree. Also, in that, so again, if I was to leave you with a take, I would also stress this idea of not being patronizing to India, because I mean, I may personally agree with many criticism that we direct at them, but that's not going to change their behavior for the better, because India is very sensitive to not being dictated to, especially not from Europe or from seafaring Anglo-Saxon countries. So that's something, that's a sensitivity that we simply need to take into account and understand, and we need to decide how we prioritize what we can get out of our relationship with India. Just back to Russia, Ukraine very briefly, but the United States started pushing India towards criticizing Russia more sharply, and the Indians in the meantime were convinced that they went great length at accommodating those expectations from their partners, because they never mentioned Russia as being the aggressor, but they condemned in general the violation of territorial integrity and the targeting of civilians. They said everything we would have expected them to say, except that Russia is responsible. And that's probably as much as you can expect Indians to do. And then the US dropped this issue, and they understood that India is probably a more useful partner against China. So we also probably have to decide whether we want to improve our trade ties with India, or find some very difficult to reach compromise on trade and technology and investment and intellectual property and climate justice, or we want to involve the Indians into a very important geopolitical issue that we may think the Indians should take more seriously, but they don't want to, and that's it. As to what we can expect for the near future, I think. Yeah, I think, you know, India having become the most populous country in the world, that's a cartoonish way to think about a country, but I think it made into the news, and it may now reach the broader political and policy-making class. So maybe India is getting more into the public consciousness, not of the general population, but of policy makers and decision makers. So I think that will have an impact down the road. Yeah.
Thank you. From a global gateway point of view, I think maybe more interest from member states' private sector would be needed in a coordinated manner, not just every man going for himself or every person going for themselves. Needs to be thought out more strategically. I'm also thinking about the European Investment Bank, that usually invests where they have a guarantee, meaning invest where others don't invest because it's more risky and countries are poorer. It's taking time to see it materialize in investment in India, which is not which is a country that has a better lending profile. So that's the very practical side. And then very briefly, when it comes to India, its perception of Russia, Ukraine, etc., I do think the EU has lately lost some credibility on what it can say about UN resolutions and humanitarian crisis, and yes, passing sanctions. So I would say they they can talk about it with India, but I'm not very optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, our host, Stefania, to wrap up the session.
Thank you very much. Today was indeed interesting. I guess I leave the last words to Zia, but I just wanted to share that on your question and to conclude today, I think the EU needs to step up its strategic engagement because in not long, India will be a competitor of the EU. It comes to defense, for example, it comes to technology, export, when it comes to also attraction from the global south, because India has legacy there to use. So how will the EU behave when India will tomorrow be a completely different actor than what it is today? So I guess this is my parting thought for today and thanks again, it was extremely interesting to hear from you all, and I've learned a lot. Thanks. Do you want to say a couple of words?
No, I think we've covered everything. I just do believe, and I'm pretty sure we will be back having these conversations also in the next year, and let's really see where the negotiations on the trade agreement leads us and what is the outcome, as Zsolt outlined, whether it will be just something that the Indians usually do when it comes to free trade agreements, or whether this will be something more tangible and beneficial for both sides. So on behalf of CEPS, Europeum and Think Visegrad, I would like to thank all of you for listening and being present here or online with us, and looking forward for following events possibly next year.
Thank you.